The late autumn chill had already begun to bite deep into the New England countryside, gnawing at the skeletal trees and seeping through the cracked window panes of St. Jude's Orphanage. Arthur Blackwood's 74 Ford LTD, a heavy, no-nonsense vehicle chosen for its reliability over flash, crunched over the gravel driveway. A plume of dust, dry and gray as ash, billowed in its wake, momentarily obscuring the decaying grandeur of the old stone building. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence that descended was not peaceful, but heavy, like a shroud. The air, crisp and cold, held a damp, earthy scent mingled with something else, a faint, almost imperceptible tang of decay and something indefinable, a profound sadness. Arthur, a man built like a sturdy oak, unbent by the years despite the shadows etched around his keen, intelligent eyes, exhaled slowly. This was it. St. Jude stood stark against a bruised sky, a monument to forgotten children and faded dreams. Its Victorian architecture, once proud, was now a tapestry of peeling paint, crumbling masonry, and a melancholic stillness that seemed to absorb all sound. Even the biting wind seemed to lose its bluster when it reached the orphanage walls, sighing rather than howling. Arthur's gaze, usually sharp and discerning, swept over the building. He was a man of his time, yet also a man out of it. His meticulously pressed dark suit, white shirt, and sensible tie were more suited to a seminary than a desolate orphanage, a stark contrast to the worn corduroy and faded denim favored by the decade. He carried a heavy leather satchel, not a briefcase, but a repository of tools for a very different kind of work, a silver crucifix, a small vial of consecrated holy water, a thick, leather-bound breviary worn smooth with use, and a multitude of lesser relics, each blessed and imbued with the power of his unwavering faith. His belief was the bedrock of his existence, forged in the fires of a childhood trauma he rarely spoke of. A shadow that moved when it shouldn't have, a voice that whispered blasphemies from empty corners, a coldness that stole the warmth from a room and, ultimately, from a young life. That event, raw and unexplained, had left him with an unshakable conviction. Malevolent demonic entities were real, and it was his sacred duty to confront them. He opened his door, the metallic groan echoing in the profound silence. As he stepped out, the cold seemed to deepen, settling into his bones. He felt the familiar tingle, the subtle oppressive presence that always heralded his particular adversaries. It wasn't strong yet, but it was there, a low hum beneath the surface of the world, a note of discord. A figure emerged from the main entrance, a woman, her wimples stark white against her somber habit, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond mere fatigue. Sister Agnes. Her eyes, though shadowed, held a flicker of desperate hope as she approached. Mr. Blackwood? Thank God you've come. Her voice, though soft, was laced with an urgency that spoke volumes. She extended a hand, surprisingly firm. I'm Sister Agnes. Thank you for answering our pleas so quickly. Sister, Arthur acknowledged, his voice deep and calm, a soothing counterpoint to her frayed nerves. The reports were concerning. My duty is to God and to the innocent he protects. His gaze swept back to the orphanage. Tell me what you've observed since your last correspondence. Sister Agnes wrung her hands. It began subtly. A melancholy. The children, they just seemed sad. But it's worsened. Now they're listless, withdrawn. They don't play. They don't laugh. Some can't even remember what they had for breakfast or the names of their favorite stories. Her voice broke. It's like something is draining the life out of them. Their joy, their very essence. And the Shroud-Wraith? Arthur asked, recalling a detail from her frantic letters. Sister Agnes shivered despite the cold. The younger ones, they whisper about it. A cold shadow that sits by their beds. A feeling of utter hopelessness. They say it eats their happy thoughts. Arthur nodded, his jaw tightening. A succubus of the soul. A classic demonic oppression, though perhaps a unique manifestation. Often, such entities feed on despair, amplify it, drawing sustenance from the agony they inflict. He sounded assured, familiar with the contours of the darkness she described. Demonic? Sister Agnes's brow furrowed. But there's no violence. No whispers of evil, no sacrilege. Just this overwhelming emptiness. "Do not be fooled, sister," Arthur replied, his voice firm, edged with the authority of long experience. The most insidious evils are often the quietest. They work from within, twisting the spirit before manifesting in more overt ways. This is a battle for their souls, sister, and we shall not surrender them. Inside, St. Jude's was even more desolate. The once bright paint of the walls was cracked and peeling, revealing layers of fading cheer. A persistent chill permeated the air, despite the efforts of a clanking boiler, and the light, even in the middle of the afternoon, seemed hesitant to penetrate the grimy windows. Arthur asked to see the children immediately. Sister Agnes led him down a long, echoing hallway, the floorboards groaning under their weight. As they approached the common room, a profound quietness hung in the air, broken only by the occasional sniffle or faint sigh. He braced himself. He had seen fear, terror, and madness in the eyes of the possessed. But nothing prepared him for this. In the common room, a dozen children, ranging from 5 to 12 years old, sat scattered across worn furniture and a faded rug. They weren't crying or screaming or even playing. They just were. Their eyes, once bright with childish wonder, were dull, staring into space. A small boy clutched a worn teddy bear, but his fingers were slack, his gaze distant. A girl, perhaps 8, stared blankly at a picture book, her face devoid of expression. There was no fidgeting, no squabbling, no innocent chaos. Just a pervasive, suffocating quiet. It was worse than fear. It was the absence of everything that made them children. Arthur felt a prickle of unease, a sensation that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a quiet horror. This was not the frenzied thrashing of a possessed victim, not the hateful glares of a demon-haunted soul. This was subtraction, an erasure. He walked among them, his presence barely registering. He placed a hand on a small girl's forehead, murmuring a quiet blessing. She didn't flinch, didn't respond. Her skin was cool, almost clammy. "It's not just their joy, Mr. Blackwood," Sister Agnes whispered, her voice thick with pain. "It's their memories, their identity. Yesterday, little Thomas couldn't tell me his own name for a full minute. And Maria, she drew a picture of her parents, but when I asked her about it, she just stared, as if she didn't know who they were." Arthur's jaw tightened. This was indeed a powerful entity, clever and insidious. It wasn't seeking to corrupt, but to consume. "They need a full banishment," Arthur declared, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. He withdrew his silver crucifix, polished to a gleaming sheen, from his satchel. "I will prepare the chapel. Sister, gather any holy articles you have. We will begin tonight." The chapel, though small, was still consecrated ground. Arthur moved with practiced efficiency, transforming the modest space into a bulwark against the unseen. He placed candles at cardinal points, each wick dipped in holy oil. He drew protective sigils on the floor with consecrated salt, the gritty crystals gleaming under the dim electric light. He laid out his relics, a small vial of blood from a revered martyr, a fragment of bone from a beatified saint, a piece of linen said to have touched the Shroud of Turin. Sister Agnes, though clearly apprehensive, assisted him, carrying a few dusty missals and a small, tarnished chalice. Her faith was simpler, perhaps purer, than his own complex theological framework, but no less fervent. As dusk settled, casting long, wavering shadows across the chapel, Arthur stood ready. He wore a priest's stole, embroidered with gold thread, over his suit, his silver crucifix held high. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. He began, his deep voice resonating with ancient Latin, invoking the power of God, of the saints, of the heavenly host. "Exorcizo te omnis spiritus immundo." He sprinkled holy water liberally, the droplets catching the candlelight, his eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of resistance, any flicker of darkness, any demonic manifestation. He expected the entity to recoil, to shriek, to manifest with violent force as so many had before. He expected the chapel to grow colder, the candles to flicker wildly, perhaps even to be extinguished. But nothing happened. The air in the chapel remained cold, but no colder than it had been. The candles burned steadily, their flames unwavering. The holy water fell on the wooden pews, evaporating silently, leaving no mark. There was no shriek, no growl, no visible sign of a struggle. The oppressive quiet, the profound sense of desolation he had felt throughout the orphanage simply deepened. Arthur continued, his voice growing in intensity, his conviction radiating outward like heat. He moved around the chapel, brandishing his crucifix, his gaze unwavering, challenging the unseen. He could feel something, a pervasive, subtle pressure, like trying to walk through deep, unseen water, but it wasn't reacting. It wasn't recoiling. It wasn't even acknowledging his presence in the way a demon would. After nearly an hour, his voice hoarse, his arms aching from holding the crucifix aloft, he stopped. He stood panting, sweat beading on his forehead, his breath fogging in the cold air. Sister Agnes, who had been kneeling, had bowed, looked up at him, her eyes wide with apprehension. "Mr. Blackwood, is it gone?" Arthur stared into the shadows, his expression a mixture of confusion and a nascent, unsettling doubt. The oppressive feeling hadn't lifted. If anything, it felt heavier, more settled. Like a pall had just been drawn tighter over the orphanage. He looked down at his silver crucifix, then at the holy water vial. They felt inert, powerless. This was not like any demon he had ever faced. This was not a creature of fire and brimstone, of blasphemy and rage. This was something else. Something cold, quiet, and terrifyingly indifferent to his sacred power. It was as if his entire arsenal, his very faith, had just struck nothing but empty air. The next morning, the children in the common room were even worse. Little Thomas couldn't recall his favorite story, one he had loved just days before. Maria, the girl who had drawn her parents, now stared at the drawing, a blank, unfamiliar look on her face, as if she had never seen it before. The pervasive gloom had intensified, pressing down on St. Jude's like a physical weight, the children's vacant eyes a silent testament to the Shroud-Wraith's growing, terrifying strength. The stale air in St. Jude's library, thick with the scent of aging paper and dust, offered no solace. Arthur Blackwood, his usually crisp clerical collar now slightly askew, hunched over a collection of leather-bound tomes. His fingers, still trembling faintly from the psychic recoil of the previous night's failed banishment, traced lines of ancient Latin script. He'd spent the better part of the morning and afternoon ensconced here, driven by a gnawing desperation he refused to acknowledge as doubt. He devoured text after text, Malleus Maleficarum, the Lesser Key of Solomon, obscure Jesuit treatises on demonic oppression, even a few fringe Protestant pamphlets detailing particularly virulent manifestations. His mind, usually a finely tuned instrument for identifying and categorizing malevolent spirits, churned with a terrifying inefficiency. Every symptom he'd observed in the children, the pervasive despair, the vacant stares, the insidious memory loss, had echoes in various demonic cases. But the resistance, that was the anomaly. His holy water had sizzled, yes, but without effect. His fervent prayers had been met not with retreat, but with a chilling intensification. The entity didn't recoil, it fed. Possession by a despair demon, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his thinning hair. Or a particularly cunning incubus, draining their vitality. He tried to force the familiar explanations to fit, but the puzzle pieces simply refused to interlock. Demonic entities, by their very nature, recoiled from the sacred. This thing had absorbed it, transformed it into fuel for its insidious hunger. A soft rap on the library door startled him. Sister Agnes stood there, her face etched with a fresh layer of worry lines. "Mr. Blackwood? Forgive the intrusion, but little Thomas isn't well." Arthur pushed himself up, his joints aching. "What is it now, sister?" He tried to keep the weariness from his voice, but it was a losing battle. He's forgotten his mother's face," she whispered, her voice cracking. He was drawing a picture of her, just now, and suddenly, he just stopped. Said he couldn't remember what she looked like anymore. Just a blink. He's weeping, inconsolable. Arthur felt a cold dread trickle down his spine. Memory loss was a symptom he'd noted, but to this extent? To obliterate the image of a child's own mother? This wasn't merely oppression, it was erosion. It was the slow, methodical stripping away of the very fabric of identity. He rushed to Thomas's bedside, the small boy curled into a fetal position, hiccuping quiet sobs into his pillow. Arthur placed a hand on his forehead, murmuring a quiet prayer for protection, but felt nothing. No malevolent chill, no oppressive heat. Just the innocent, heart-wrenching despair of a child losing something fundamental. Later that evening, after a futile attempt to comfort Thomas, Arthur retreated to his austere room, the weight of his failures pressing down on him. His eyes fell upon an old, leather-bound address book he carried, a relic from his earlier, less renowned days. Within its brittle pages, under academics, esoteric, was a name he hadn't thought of in years, Professor Alastair Finch. Finch was an anachronism, a tweed-clad recluse from a defunct university department of comparative mythologies. Arthur had met him at a dusty academic conference decades ago, where Finch had delivered a rambling, yet strangely compelling, paper on ethereal resonance parasites and eidetic constructs sustained by collective human emotion. Arthur, then a young, fiercely devout seminarian, had dismissed it as fanciful pseudoscience. Now, a faint, desperate hope, like a dying ember, flickered within him. He located the orphanage's old rotary phone in the cramped office next to the kitchen. The dial felt stiff beneath his finger as he punched in Finch's long-distance number, each click a drumbeat against his waning confidence. The ringing on the other end was interminably long, punctuated by static, a ghostly echo of the vast distance between New England and Finch's reputed hermitage in the Scottish Highlands. Finally, a reedy, slightly impatient voice answered. "Finch. Who is this, and why are you disturbing my communion with the Ancient Ones?" Arthur cleared his throat. "Professor Finch, this is Arthur Blackwood. We met, some years ago, at the Leeds Symposium." A long pause. Arthur heard a distinct scratching sound, like a quill on parchment. "Blackwood? Ah, yes. The young firebrand. The demonologist with the ironclad convictions. To what do I owe the dubious pleasure? Last I recall, you found my work rather ungodly." Finch's voice held a dry, academic amusement that grated on Arthur's nerves. "Professor, I have encountered an entity. Something unlike anything I've faced before." Arthur found himself choosing his words carefully, unwilling to fully admit the extent of his bewilderment. "It's plaguing an orphanage. Children are experiencing profound despair, memory loss. My usual methods, the blessed artifacts, the rites of exorcism, they are ineffective. Worse, they seem to empower it." Another pause, longer this time. Then a low chuckle. "Ineffective, you say? And empowering? How intriguing. Tell me, Mr. Blackwood, does this entity possess a distinct physical form? Does it speak in tongues? Does it exhibit traditional signs of demonic possession, levitation, unholy strength, a distinct sulfurous odor?" "No," Arthur admitted, a knot tightening in his stomach. "It manifests as a chill, a shadow, a pervasive sense of dread. The children call it the Shroud-Wraith. It seems to feed on their joy, their memories." Finch hummed, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Just as I suspected. You've stumbled upon a rather unique specimen, Mr. Blackwood. Not a demon, not in your conventional, Abrahamic sense." Arthur bristled. "Not a demon? Then what, pray tell, is it?" "A psychic echo," Finch mused. "A residual entity. Perhaps a disparator, as some obscure Celtic texts refer to them. These are not fallen angels, Mr. Blackwood. They are creatures of resonance, formed from concentrated human emotion, often trauma. They don't seek to corrupt souls for a divine struggle, they merely consume. They are parasites, feeding on the very energy of hope, joy, and, yes, memory." "Parasites?" Arthur scoffed, a mixture of disbelief and anger rising. "This is ridiculous. It's an act of pure evil, Professor. It must be demonic in origin." "Evil, yes," Finch conceded patiently, "but not necessarily demonic. Imagine a void, Mr. Blackwood. A hunger that exists outside the conventional framework of good and evil. It has no will, no motive beyond its own sustenance. Your rituals, your faith, they are designed to repel demonic will. but a creature of pure hunger, a void, simply absorbs and digests. Your holy energy, your fervent belief, is simply another form of powerful emotional resonance for it to consume. Arthur paced the small office, the phone cord tangling around his legs. Finch's words were a cold bucket of water dumped on his entire life's work. His rigid worldview, so carefully constructed over decades, was cracking under the weight of this alien explanation. So you're saying, my methods are useless? Not useless, per se, Finch corrected. Misdirected. You're trying to kill a shadow with a sword, Mr. Blackwood. These entities feed on positive emotional energy. They thrive where hope withers. To banish them, you must understand their nature. They are vulnerable not to the rejection of evil, but to the overwhelm of their opposite. The sheer, unadulterated force of joy, memory, human connection. Nonsense, Arthur muttered, though the word felt hollow even to his own ears. He thought of Thomas, his blank, tear-stained face. How can one fight a creature that feeds on hope with more hope? That, Mr. Blackwood, is the challenge, Finch said, a hint of steel in his reedy voice. It requires a different kind of faith. Not faith in dogma, but faith in the profound resilience of the human spirit. It requires understanding, not just condemnation. I can perhaps point you towards some less conventional avenues of research. Old folk remedies. Lost shamanic rites. Things that predate your church's understanding of evil. Arthur didn't know whether to scream or laugh. Shamanic rites? This was madness. Yet, as he looked out the window at the darkened orphanage, a profound chill settled over him. The very air felt heavier, laden with an invisible sorrow. Professor, Arthur said, his voice raw, send me what you can. Anything. Wisely chosen, Mr. Blackwood. Though be warned, what you will learn may shake the very foundations of your understanding. With that, Finch gave a cryptic address and a promise to send some materials, then promptly hung up, leaving Arthur with a dial tone that seemed to mock his certainty. The conversation with Finch had barely concluded when a piercing, collective scream ripped through the orphanage. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of profound, agonizing loss. Arthur burst out of the office, his heart pounding. Children were stumbling out of their dormitories, their eyes wide and unfocused, their small hands clutching at their heads. My teddy bear. Where's my teddy bear? One little girl whimpered, tears streaming down her face, even though the worn toy lay clutched in her other hand. I can't remember its name. A boy of 7, usually boisterous, stared blankly at his own reflection in a corridor mirror. Who is that? He murmured, a terrifying echo of Thomas's earlier distress. The Shroud-Wraith was no longer subtle. It was a visible, undulating wave of despair, a cold, hungry entity that now moved freely through the halls, its presence like a sudden vacuum, sucking the warmth and light from every memory, every joyful thought. It wasn't a roar, not a physical attack, but a terrifying, silent erasure. As Arthur watched in horror, the very essence of the children, their individual histories, their small, precious joys, were being systematically consumed, leaving behind empty shells. He clutched his crucifix, the metal cold and inert in his hand. Finch's words echoed in his mind, sharp and insistent. Your holy energy, your fervent belief, is simply another form of powerful emotional resonance for it to consume. His methods were useless. Worse, they were aiding the very entity he sought to banish. A cold, terrifying realization dawned. Arthur Blackwood, the renowned demonologist, was utterly, completely helpless. And the children were vanishing before his very eyes. The heavy silence of St. Jude's settled over Arthur Blackwood like a burial shroud. It wasn't the quiet of peace, but the oppressive stillness of profound emptiness. 2 days had passed since his last failed attempt at banishment, and with each ticking hour, the orphanage seemed to sink deeper into a suffocating gloom. The children, once merely despondent, now moved like ghosts, their small faces pale, eyes wide and unfocused, their laughter a distant, forgotten echo. Even the air felt thinner, as if some unseen presence was siphoning the very oxygen of hope from the building. Arthur had spent the intervening time in a restless cycle of prayer, research, and quiet desperation. He'd meticulously reread every passage of the Ritual Romanum, consulted obscure grimoires on demonology, and prayed until his knees ached and his throat was hoarse. Yet, the answers eluded him. Every verse, every ritual, every invocation of divine power seemed to bounce off an invisible, indifferent wall. Sister Agnes found him in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, not in prayer, but staring blankly at a small, tarnished silver crucifix he clutched in his hand. Her usually firm posture seemed to sag, her face etched with a deeper worry. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice raspy. "Little Timothy. He's forgotten his mother's face." The words hit Arthur like a physical blow. He slowly turned, his eyes hollow. Timothy, a bright-eyed 6-year-old just a week ago, whose drawings of his absent mother had adorned the walls of the playroom, was now a blank slate. The Shroud-Wraith wasn't just stealing joy, it was devouring memory, the very essence of identity. "How?" Arthur whispered, his voice thick with unspent tears. "How can it be this fast?" Sister Agnes sat beside him on the cold pew. He just stared at the photograph, Arthur. No recognition. Just emptiness. She wrung her hands. "The other children are worse, too. They don't play, they barely eat." I heard Martha, one of the older girls, crying because she couldn't remember the words to her favorite nursery rhyme. Arthur closed his eyes, a tremor running through him. This wasn't demonic possession. Demonic entities tormented, they twisted, they corrupted. But they didn't erase. They sought souls for damnation, not for consumption. This was different. This was a void. He stood, his resolve hardening despite the tremor of doubt that now shook the foundations of his faith. "I will try again," he announced, his voice firmer than he felt. "A full exorcism. The rites of Leo XIII." Sister Agnes looked at him, her skepticism clear. "Arthur, you've tried so many things. Holy water, blessed oil, the St. Benedict medal, they've had no effect. This thing, it doesn't seem to care about such things." "It must," Arthur insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "It must be a demon, sister. What else could it be? And if it is a demon, then the Church's most potent weapon, the Ritual Romanum, must prevail." He needed it to prevail. His entire life was built on this premise. He spent the next few hours preparing, not just the physical tools, but his own spiritual armor. He fasted, prayed ceaselessly, and immersed himself in scripture, seeking a passage, a verse, a single sign that would confirm his path. He polished the silver crucifix until it gleamed, consecrated fresh holy water, and anointed himself with blessed oil, feeling the familiar comfort of these sacred rituals. This time, he would not hold back. This time, he would bring the full force of his faith and the Church's authority to bear. Gathering Sister Agnes and a few of the more lucid orphanage staff, Arthur led them to the main common room, where the children often congregated. The room, usually filled with the sounds of shuffling feet and muted murmurs, was eerily quiet. A dozen children sat huddled together on threadbare couches, their eyes fixed on nothing, their bodies almost motionless. Timothy, his small frame slumped, looked utterly lost. Arthur felt a surge of righteous anger, a renewed conviction that this abomination, whatever it was, had to be cast out. He clutched his most revered relic, a first-class relic of Saint Michael the Archangel, a sliver of bone encased in a silver locket, said to have been used in countless banishments since the Middle Ages. He poured fresh holy water into a sprinkler, its droplets shimmering in the dim light. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," Arthur intoned, his voice resonating with a power he desperately tried to conjure. "I command you, foul spirit, to depart from these innocent children. By the authority of the Most High God, I compel you." He began the solemn prayers, his Latin clear and strong, interspersed with the sprinkling of holy water. He moved through the room, his eyes scanning for any sign of a demonic presence, a flicker in the shadows, a sudden drop in temperature, a guttural growl. Nothing. The children remained as they were, utterly unresponsive, as if the sounds were mere static. He raised the St. Michael relic, holding it high. "By the power of St. Michael, Prince of the Heavenly Host, I cast you out." He swept the relic through the air, then pressed it against the forehead of one of the older girls, a quiet child named Clara who had been among the first to show symptoms. He expected a jolt, a scream, a reaction. He got none. Clara's eyes remained vacant, her skin cold beneath his touch. The relic, a symbol of divine victory, felt inert, a mere piece of metal against her flesh. Arthur moved with growing desperation, from child to child, repeating the prayers, pressing the relic, sprinkling the water. With each failed attempt, the confidence that had driven him ebbed away, replaced by a growing chill of dread that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He could feel it now, the presence, a vast, cold emptiness that seemed to absorb his efforts, rendering them meaningless. He finished, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands trembling. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by silent, empty children, his holy water sprinkler dripping uselessly onto the floorboards. The Shroud-Wraith had not recoiled. It had not screamed. It had not even acknowledged his presence. In fact, if anything, the despair in the room seemed to have deepened, the children's eyes even more distant than before. He looked at Sister Agnes, her face a mask of sorrow. It did nothing, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. His entire body felt hollowed out, as if the entity had just drained his own conviction. Arthur, Sister Agnes began gently, perhaps this isn't a battle for holy relics. Perhaps it requires something else. He shook his head, denial warring with the undeniable evidence. What else could there be, sister? What else could stand against such evil? He retreated to his room, the familiar comfort of his crucifix and rosary now mocking him from the bedside table. He picked up his worn leather-bound Bible, its pages filled with centuries of wisdom, and found himself staring at the text without truly seeing it. Demons, demons, his mind screamed. He had faced them, fought them, banished them. He knew their tricks, their weaknesses. But this thing was playing a different game, a game for which his rulebook was useless. The memory of Professor Finch's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. Some entities, they exist beyond that dichotomy of divine and infernal. They are elemental, primal. Their sustenance isn't your soul for damnation, but your very capacity to feel. At the time, Arthur had dismissed it as academic eccentricity. Now, it felt like a chilling prophecy. He looked at his hands, calloused from clutching rosaries, stained from holy oil. His life's work, his unwavering faith, his very identity, they were all rooted in the conviction that malevolent entities were fundamentally demonic. What if he was wrong? What if the traumatic event of his youth, the one that had set him on this path, had been misinterpreted? What if he had been fighting shadows, believing them to be devils, when the true enemy was something far more insidious, far more alien? The thought was a chasm opening beneath him. It wasn't just his professional reputation at stake, it was his spiritual bedrock. To admit this entity wasn't demonic was to admit that the tools he had wielded for decades were useless. It was to admit that his understanding of the supernatural world, the one he had so diligently constructed, was fundamentally flawed. But then, he saw Timothy's blank eyes in his mind's eye, Clara's unseeing gaze. The quiet, profound despair of children who had lost their joy, their memories, their very selves. This wasn't about his dogma, it was about them. With a heavy, trembling hand, Arthur picked up the telephone receiver. His fingers fumbled slightly as he dialed Professor Finch's number. He waited, the silence on the line almost as oppressive as the silence in the orphanage. Finch's voice, when it came, was surprisingly clear, almost as if he had been expecting the call. Arthur? You sound distressed. Professor, Arthur choked out, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. You were right. The holy relics, the exorcism, nothing. It has no effect. The children are worse. It's feeding, Professor. On their memories, their happiness. What is this thing? There was a pause on Finch's end, a thoughtful silence. As I suspected, Arthur. Your traditional methods are designed for a specific kind of entity, one that operates within a well-defined spiritual economy. What you face now, it does not play by those rules. So, what are the rules? Arthur pleaded, his voice raw. How do you fight something that isn't a demon, isn't a ghost, isn't anything in my books? What weapon do I have? Not a weapon, Arthur. Not in the way you understand it, Finch replied, his voice taking on a more serious, almost conspiratorial tone. Your strength has always been in your faith, your conviction in the divine. But this entity feeds on the absence of such things. It thrives on despair, on emptiness. To fight it, you must counter its nature. You must cultivate what it consumes. Arthur frowned, bewildered. Cultivate despair? Emptiness? No, Arthur, the opposite, Finch corrected, a hint of something like excitement in his voice. You must cultivate joy, hope, memory. Not merely believe in them, but manifest them. It is a different kind of alchemy, a different kind of faith, perhaps. One rooted not in dogma, but in the raw, vibrant power of the human spirit itself. Arthur stared at his crucifix, then out the window at the darkening New England sky, the silhouette of St. Jude's oblique monument against the twilight. His usual implements of war lay scattered and useless. He was in uncharted territory, confronted by an enemy for which his entire life's training was obsolete. But Finch's words, as strange as they sounded, offered a thread of possibility. A terrifying, radical possibility that required him to abandon everything he thought he knew. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He had failed. His faith, his methods, his holy relics, all had proven impotent against the Shroud-Wraith. His rigid worldview had shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of terrifying unknowns. But he wouldn't give up. Not while the children still breathed. Professor, Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm, a new kind of resolve forming in its depths. Tell me everything. Tell me what I need to do. He was ready to learn, to change, to shed the skin of the Demonologist and become something new, something unknown, to save the souls he was sworn to protect. The only question that remained was whether he could truly walk away from a lifetime of certainty and embrace a path that felt, to every fiber of his being, like heresy. The stale air in St. Jude's common room seemed to have thickened, pressing down on Arthur like a physical weight. 3 days. 3 days since his last, futile attempt at exorcism, since the entity, the Shroud-Wraith, had mocked his most sacred rituals. The children were worse. Their eyes held a vacant, faraway look, their movements sluggish, their faint voices barely whispers. He watched a girl, no older than 6, tracing patterns in the dust on the floor, a single, forgotten doll clutched in her hand. Her face was devoid of expression, a chilling blank slate. Arthur ran a hand through his already disheveled hair. His rosary beads, once a source of comfort, felt cold and inert in his pocket. The truth, ugly and undeniable, clawed at his mind. His entire life's work, his unwavering certainty, had been a magnificent, dangerous delusion. This wasn't a demon. It didn't fear God's name, nor the symbols of his sacrifice. It fed on something else, something far more insidious and personal. He pulled out his battered notebook, its pages filled with frantic, increasingly desperate scrawls, and dialed Professor Finch's number. The rotary phone's clicks and whirs were loud in the oppressive silence of the orphanage. Finch answered on the 3rd ring, his voice reedy but alert. Blackwood. I take it my insights proved pertinent. Arthur swallowed, the admission tasting like ash. Professor, it's worse. Much worse. My methods, they did nothing. The children are fading. You were right. It's not a demon. It's something else entirely. It feeds on their joy, their memories. They don't even remember their own names, some of them. His voice cracked, raw with a new, terrifying vulnerability. I need your help, Professor. What do I do? There was a moment of silence on Finch's end, a heavy pause that spoke volumes. Blackwood, I always sensed you had an adaptable mind, buried beneath layers of righteous certainty. Good. That's good. This Shroud-Wraith, as the children call it, a remarkably accurate description, by the way, is a desperator. They are elemental parasites, not sentient beings of malice, but forces of nature, drawn to the void of human emotion. You cannot banish a vacuum with holy water. You must fill it. Fill it with what? Arthur asked, a desperate flicker of hope igniting in the darkness of his mind. Joy, hope, love, memory. The very things it consumes. But not just a flicker, Blackwood. A surge. A concentrated, focused burst of pure, unadulterated positive energy. It's like trying to put out a fire with water, but instead of a bucket, you need a tidal wave. How? The children. They have nothing left to give. Arthur gestured helplessly around the common room. Their memories are gone, their spirits shattered. Then you must help them remember, Finch instructed, his voice gaining a precise, academic tone. This isn't an exorcism, Blackwood. It's a reawakening. You need to create an environment saturated with positive stimuli. Simple things. Laughter. Music. Stories. Tangible reminders of happiness. The Shroud-Wraith, it feeds on the absence of these things. A concentrated wave of their presence will be anathema to it. It will weaken it, drive it back, but it won't destroy it entirely. Not yet. What kind of ritual? Arthur asked, clutching the phone tighter. Specifics, Professor. I need specifics. No candles of blessed wax. Use any candle, lit with intention for light and warmth. No holy water, but pure, clean water, poured with intention for clarity and cleansing. No scriptures, but stories. Stories of innocent delight, of simple pleasures, of kindness remembered. The power comes not from the object's sacredness, Blackwood, but from the human will and emotion invested in it. You are creating a countercurrent, a focal point of pure, positive energy. Think of it as a beacon, guiding lost memories back and searing the parasitic entity. Arthur scribbled furiously, his mind racing. It was so utterly alien, so completely outside the framework of his entire existence, yet it resonated with a terrible, undeniable logic. He hung up, the silence of the common room now feeling heavier, imbued with the weight of this new, terrifying mission. Sister Agnes entered, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. She carried a tray with stale bread and thin soup. Any luck, Arthur? She asked, her gaze sweeping over the listless children. He met her eyes, a strange mix of terror and determination in his own. Yes, sister. I think so. But it's not what you think. It's different. We need to create joy, sister. We need to make the children remember happiness. Sister Agnes looked at him, her brow furrowed. Arthur, these children haven't smiled in weeks. Some of them barely speak. How do you conjure joy out of thin air? Not thin air, he corrected, gesturing to his notes. From their own fading memories. Professor Finch believes this entity, this Shroud-Wraith, feeds on the absence of joy. We have to flood this place with its presence. We need to create a surge of positive emotion. He explained Finch's instructions, watching as Sister Agnes's initial skepticism slowly gave way to a glimmer of pragmatic hope. So, no more Latin chants and holy relics, she asked, a faint irony in her voice. No, Arthur admitted, the word feeling oddly liberating. We need music. Cheerful music. And stories. Simple, happy stories. Do you have any of their old things? Toys, drawings, anything that might spark a memory. Sister Agnes nodded slowly. Some of them came with a few trinkets. Most were lost, or forgotten, or simply put away for safekeeping. I could find them. And the old record player in the staff room. It still works, I think. We have some nursery rhymes, Christmas carols. Perfect, Arthur said, a surge of adrenaline pushing back the exhaustion. This afternoon, in the common room, we'll light every candle we can find. Not blessed, just lit with intention. We'll make this room a beacon. The common room, transformed, felt alien to Arthur. There were no crucifixes prominently displayed, no vials of holy water at the ready. Instead, Sister Agnes had draped colorful, albeit faded, blankets over the hard wooden benches. A small, rickety table in the center held a cluster of candles, simple household candles, not blessed altar candles, their flames dancing softly, casting a warm, flickering glow. On the floor, scattered among the children, were small, personal items Agnes had managed to unearth. A worn teddy bear, a faded illustration from a storybook, a smooth, polished stone, a wooden whistle. The children, initially, were unresponsive. They sat with their characteristic apathy, their eyes distant even amidst the soft, unfamiliar glow. All right, everyone, Arthur began, his voice feeling strangely awkward without the usual gravitas of a prayer. "Sister Agnes and we want to tell you some stories today." "Happy stories." He cleared his throat. "Sister Agnes, perhaps you could start us off?" Sister Agnes, her face softened by the candlelight, wound up the old record player. A scratchy but undeniably cheerful tune, a simple nursery rhyme about a skipping lamb, filled the room. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the past weeks. She then picked up a small, hand-knitted doll. "This was Martha's," she said softly, gesturing to a small girl in the front. Martha's eyes, usually vacant, flickered. "Martha, do you remember playing with Dolly? You used to make her dance, remember?" Martha didn't respond immediately, but her fingers twitched, a hesitant, almost forgotten muscle memory. Arthur, feeling incredibly out of his depth but forcing himself to embrace the foreign methodology, picked up a worn picture book. Once upon a time, he began, in a little house, lived a boy who loved to build forts out of blankets. He'd gather all the pillows and blankets he could find and make a secret castle where he could imagine he was a king or a knight battling dragons. He kept his voice light, engaging, something he hadn't done since his own distant childhood. He found himself describing the scent of the blankets, the thrill of hiding, the simple joy of imagination. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. The ambient dread that usually clung to the orphanage like a shroud seemed to thin. The air felt fractionally lighter, the cold less biting. As Arthur spoke, Sister Agnes moved among the children, gently placing their forgotten treasures in their hands. A little boy named Thomas, who had been catatonic for days, felt the smooth stone in his palm. His brow furrowed in concentration. "My river stone," he whispered, a threadbare memory reawakening. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, then vanished, like a shy firefly. That flicker was enough. It was a pinprick of light, a spark. As the nursery rhyme record ended and Agnes put on a new, equally cheerful tune, a low hum filled the room. It wasn't sound, but a sensation. The Shroud-Wraith was reacting. Arthur could feel it, a palpable shift in the air, like a sudden drop in pressure. A child, Clara, who had been staring blankly at the wall, giggled. It was a small, reedy sound, like a rusty hinge, but it was laughter. She pointed at the worn teddy bear in her lap. "Teddy. He likes honey," she mumbled, a memory resurfacing. The hum intensified, and the flickering candlelight seemed to dim, as if the very light was struggling against an unseen force. But the music played on, the stories continued, and the small, tentative sparks of joy among the children, though fleeting, were undeniably present. The entity recoiled. Arthur didn't see it, but he felt it. A cold, sharp, almost painful sensation, like a sudden intake of breath from an unseen mouth. The oppressive weight in the room eased further. The air felt cleaner, lighter, for the first time in weeks. It wasn't gone, not entirely, but its presence was diminished, fractured. The candles, which had dimmed for a moment, flared brightly again. The children, for a brief, precious instant, looked more present, more alive. Thomas actually smiled, a genuine, if weak, smile, and hugged his river stone. Arthur exchanged a look with Sister Agnes, a silent communication of astonishment and a fragile, burgeoning hope. It worked. Finch was right. The positive energy, the rekindled memories, they were poison to the Wraith. But then, as the last record scratched to a halt and the stories tapered off, the faint smiles on the children's faces faded. Their eyes, though briefly lucid, began to cloud over again. The lighter atmosphere, so recently present, started to recede, replaced by the familiar, encroaching gloom. The Shroud-Wraith hadn't been banished. It had merely been wounded, driven back. It lingered, a dark, hungry shadow at the periphery, waiting for the brief light to die. Arthur felt a crushing wave of disappointment, quickly followed by a fierce, renewed determination. It was insufficient. The surge of joy, while potent, had been too small, too fleeting. It was a splash, not the tidal wave Finch had described. He looked at the children, their faces already beginning to lose the brief spark of life he had seen. The Wraith was still there, still feeding. He had found its weakness, its vulnerability, but he hadn't found the means to utterly destroy it. Not yet. He had to find a way to make that surge of positive energy last, to make it overwhelming and absolute, before the last vestiges of hope and memory were consumed forever. But how do you sustain a tidal wave of joy in a place consumed by despair? He knew the answer was staring him in the face, but he just couldn't grasp it. The air in St. Jude's no longer merely felt cold. It was a physical weight, pressing down on every breath, every thought. The children, huddled in their beds, were ghosts of their former selves, their eyes dulled, their laughter a forgotten echo. The success of Arthur's initial, experimental ritual had been fleeting, a candle flame in a hurricane. It had weakened the Shroud-Wraith, yes, but also provoked it, making its oppression an almost tangible shroud over the orphanage. But Arthur Blackwood was no longer the man who had arrived at St. Jude's. The last few days had stripped away layers of certainty, exposing a raw, vulnerable core that was, paradoxically, stronger. Finch's cryptic warnings, the Wraith's baffling resistance, and the children's fading light had forced him to look beyond the rigid texts, beyond the familiar scent of frankincense and the Latin incantations that had been his shield for decades. He saw now that faith, true faith, was not a blind adherence to dogma, but an unwavering pursuit of truth, wherever it might lead. He found Sister Agnes in the kitchen, meticulously polishing tarnished silver, a futile attempt at order in chaos. Her face was etched with fatigue, but her eyes, though weary, held a steely resolve. "It knows we're close," Arthur stated, without preamble. "It's fighting back harder now, draining them faster." Sister Agnes sighed, her breath catching. "Little Mary, she doesn't remember her own name this morning. Only the shadow." Arthur's jaw tightened. This was it. The precipice. He had to succeed, or the children would be lost, their souls consumed by an entity his old worldview could never have comprehended. "We need to do something radical," he said, his voice low but firm. "Something that combines what I know with what Professor Finch has shown me. We need to feed it, sister. But not with despair." Sister Agnes looked at him, a flicker of bewildered hope in her eyes. "Feed it? Mr. Blackwood, what are you suggesting?" "Joy. Memories. Hope," Arthur explained, pacing the small kitchen. "It devours these things, yes. But it consumes the absence of them. It feeds on the void. If we fill that void with something real, something vibrant, something sacred in its own way, we can overwhelm it. Drown it in what it cannot digest." He stopped, turning to face her fully. "And we can't do it alone. The children, they have to participate. They have to choose to remember, to hope, to find that spark again. Their wills, combined with our unified intent, will be the hammer." Sister Agnes clasped her hands, her knuckles white. "The children, they're so weak. How can we ask them for this?" "Because it's their only chance," Arthur said, conviction radiating from him. "And because they are not merely victims. They are vessels of innocence, of pure, unblemished light. If a demon hunts them, it's because it craves that light. This creature, it just wants to extinguish it. We have to make them shine." Together, they moved through the silent halls, a shared grim determination linking them. Arthur's heart ached at the sight of the children, their faces pale, their small forms huddled. He knelt beside a small boy named Thomas, who merely stared at the wall. "Thomas," Arthur began gently, "do you remember the story Sister Agnes told us yesterday? About the little squirrel who found the biggest acorn?" No response. Arthur felt a surge of despair, but quickly stifled it. This was the Wraith's influence. He wouldn't let it take hold. "Sister Agnes," he called softly, "bring me a candle. And a cross. And, yes, a small wooden toy from the playbox." He set about preparing the common room. He placed the familiar crucifix on the mantel, then, beside it, a small, worn teddy bear and a brightly painted spinning top. He lit votive candles, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows that, for once, felt warm rather than menacing. He blessed the room with holy water, but this time, as he sprinkled it, his prayer was not just for protection against evil, but for the restoration of joy, for the remembrance of grace. When the children were gathered, coaxed from their beds by Sister Agnes and the few remaining carers, the room felt fragile, poised on a knife's edge. The Wraith's presence was a palpable chill, a weight on their chest. Arthur stood before them, a towering figure in his dark suit, but his eyes were different. Less stern, more compassionate. "Children," he began, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I know you're tired. I know you feel cold. But there is a warmth inside each of you, a light that this shadow wants to steal. It feeds on sadness, on forgotten dreams." He picked up the spinning top. This belonged to a boy named Peter. He loved to watch it spin, didn't he, Sister Agnes? Sister Agnes nodded, a soft smile gracing her lips. He did. He said it looked like a tiny, joyful whirlwind. Arthur looked at the children. "That joy, it's still there. It's hiding. We're going to find it. We're going to make it too bright for the shadow to bear." He held up a rosary in one hand, but in the other, he held the teddy bear. "We will pray, yes, but we will also remember. We will sing. We will feel the good things that live inside us. The shadow cannot touch those if we hold them tight." He looked at Sister Agnes. She understood. Her devotion to God was absolute, but her love for the children transcended doctrine. Her pragmatic ally had become a fervent co-conspirator in a ritual of radical, unexpected faith. "What was your favorite memory, Sister Agnes?" Arthur asked, a challenge in his voice. Sister Agnes closed her eyes for a moment. "The day I first arrived here as a novice. The smell of the old rose bushes by the chapel. The children's laughter echoing in the courtyard. It was pure hope." As she spoke, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth seemed to radiate from her, pushing back against the chill. A few of the children, stirring, looked towards her. Arthur nodded. "Excellent. Now, children, does anyone remember a favorite game? A favorite story? Something that made you smile?" The silence was heavy. The Shroud-Wraith, sensing the shift, retaliated. The candles flickered violently, and a guttural, whispering groan echoed through the room, a sound that seemed to scrape at the very edges of their minds, threatening to pull their fragile thoughts back into the abyss. Little Thomas whimpered, covering his ears. Arthur felt it, the oppressive weight, the insidious suggestion that it was all hopeless, that he was a fool. His old self would have lashed out with an exorcism rite, would have commanded it to flee in the name of God. But this entity did not heed such commands in the way a demon would. It needed to be drowned. He planted his feet, gripping his rosary, but his gaze was not on the crucifix, but on the children. "No," he boomed, his voice cutting through the wraith's whispers. "We will not let it take this from us. It feeds on your silence, your fear. We will starve it." He looked at Mary, the girl who had forgotten her name. "Mary, do you remember the red bird that used to sing outside your window? The one with the bright, bright feathers?" Mary's dull eyes blinked slowly. Then a tiny flicker. "Red bird," she whispered, her voice reedy. "Yes," Arthur encouraged, a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. "And what did it do?" "It sang," Mary murmured, a faint echo of memory, a fragile spark. "And what did it sound like, Mary?" Arthur pressed, his voice urging, pulling at the forgotten threads. Slowly, painstakingly, Mary hummed a broken, tuneless melody. It was a terrible sound, yet it was a breakthrough. The wraith screamed then, a sound like tearing silk, the shadows in the corners of the room seeming to writhe. The candles dimmed, the light struggling. "Sing with her," Arthur commanded, his voice now imbued with a furious, righteous energy that was both priestly and profoundly human. "Sing any song. Your favorite hymn. A nursery rhyme. Anything." Sister Agnes, tears streaming down her face, began to sing. Her voice, cracked with emotion, was surprisingly strong, amazing grace. How sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. One of the older girls, Sarah, her memory returning in fragments, remembered a skipping rhyme, her voice hesitant at first, then gaining strength. "Ring around the rosy, pockets full of posies." The children, seeing the adults lead, seeing a crack in the despair, slowly began to join in. A cacophony of small, uncertain voices, singing different songs, remembering different things, but all of them reaching for a shared, potent emotion, recollection. Arthur stood at the heart of it, a conduit. He closed his eyes, not to pray for intercession, but to focus the surging, raw energy. He remembered his own childhood, a moment of unblemished joy before the shadow had fallen, his mother's laughter, the taste of freshly baked bread. He didn't just remember, he felt it, letting the warmth spread through him, a defiant shield against the Wraith's chill. The Shroud-Wraith shrieked, a terrible sound of pure agony. The air grew impossibly cold, then impossibly hot. Visions flashed before Arthur's eyes, his deepest fears, his past failures, the faces of those he couldn't save. It tried to drag him into his own despair, to make him doubt. "No!" Arthur roared, his eyes snapping open. He held up his rosary in one hand, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of unwavering purpose. In the other, he held the spinning top, the embodiment of innocent joy. "You cannot have them. You feed on the absence, but we are presence. We are light. You are nothing. You are void." The children's voices, once a discordant jumble, began to coalesce, empowered by Arthur's raw conviction. Sister Agnes's hymn, Sarah's rhyme, Mary's broken tune, they wove together, a tapestry of defiance. The candles flared, unnaturally bright, casting back the encroaching shadows. The Shroud-Wraith, unable to withstand the concentrated, pure emotional outpouring, began to unravel. Its shadowy form writhed, contorted, like smoke caught in a hurricane. It let out one final, piercing wail, a sound of utter, agonizing defeat, of true starvation, and then, with a violent shudder that shook the very foundations of St. Jude's, it dissipated, dissolving into nothingness. The chill receded, replaced by a sudden, profound warmth. The shadows fled, leaving only the soft glow of the candles. Silence. Then, a sound Arthur hadn't heard in days, a small, uncertain giggle from Thomas. Then another, from Mary. The children looked around, their eyes wide, slowly, wondrously, remembering. Arthur stood there, breathing heavily, the rosary and the spinning top still clutched in his hands. He felt utterly drained, but also light. He felt the shift within himself, a tectonic plate moving deep inside his soul. The world hadn't ended. God hadn't abandoned him for venturing beyond his dogma. Instead, he had found a deeper truth, a broader understanding of grace and evil, of the light that resided in every human heart, a light powerful enough to banish even the deepest despair. Sister Agnes approached him, her face radiant with a mixture of exhaustion and profound relief. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, you saved them. All of us." Arthur looked at the recovering children, their faces slowly regaining color, their eyes sparkling with nascent joy and returning memories. He offered a small, tired smile. "Not me, sister. Not just me. Us. And them." He looked down at the spinning top, then at the crucifix. They were not at odds. They were two facets of the same profound, mysterious reality. True faith, he now understood, was not just about believing in the unseen, but about seeing the truth, even when it challenged every preconceived notion. Leaving St. Jude's days later, the New England countryside no longer felt solely oppressive. The sky, though still gray, held a promise of clearing. Arthur Blackwood was still a demonologist, but the rigid shell had cracked, revealing a man far more attuned to the nuances of the world, to the countless forms of malevolence and the even more countless forms of light. His methods would change. His understanding would deepen. The world was larger, more terrifying, and more wondrous than he had ever allowed himself to believe. He had faced a shadow that ate souls, and in doing so, had found his own. And as the road stretched out before him, he knew this was only the beginning of a different, far more complex journey. The demons, he was sure, would still be waiting. But now he would be ready for whatever else might lurk in the shadows, beyond the reach of holy water and Latin prayers. He was ready for truth.